Everybody, welcome back for another video. Guess let's jump into it. There's been so many videos lately that are just kind of beating up on Gen Z, and I really do have an opinion on it. And I think it is a little more kind of counter to the common consensus that they're just horrible generations. And I think I might want to play a little bit of devil's advocate on this one. And so the question is, what's wrong with Gen Z? Why are they so different? Are they a cursed generation? And in this video, I really want to go over 3 different reasons why I think Gen Z is the way that it is, honestly. So let's go ahead and start with number 1. They grew up in constant uncertainty. As a millennial, we talk about all the things that we've lived through in our lives. The recession, 9/11, Iraq, Afghanistan, the housing collapse, the political division that we've seen over the past decade especially. But the fact is, most of us were pretty much adults when these things started to happen, maybe in our late teens, but kind of old enough to really kind of deal with these. A lot of us grew up in some of the best times in America, the 80s, the 90s, the times where America knew who it was and our global and cultural influence was at its peak. I think Gen Z grew up into a world of really constant turmoil. Starting in 1996 or 1997, that means that they would have been about 5 years old when 9/11 happened. And since then, it was real just kind of cascading events that lasted more than 20 years to get us to where we are today. Gen Z grew up in a world that was created by Halliburton, by General Dynamics, by Dynacorp, by Triple Canopy, the big military industrial complex. They were a generation raised under the umbrella and the embrace of the military industrial complex. It was an era where war was pretty much the constant backdrop in our society, even if it wasn't so present all the time in our lives. Obviously, it was more of a background noise, a constant thing that was always there. America playing a part in a war somewhere. War was the backdrop of their adolescence. And in this adolescence, the US really ran off of slogans of hope while simultaneously bombing kids on the other side of the world. Bombing poor kids from villages who really had nothing to do with anything. Casualties of war. But this was something that was commonly known. This is something that kids grew up seeing on Live Leak, even on YouTube, before it really changed to what it is now. And they watched as a generation of Americans, as multiple generations of Americans marched off to fight for corporate interests, veiled in a kind of cracked facade of patriotism, while at the same time Wall Street gutted the housing market and sent countless families into ruin. Gen Z watches justice and accountability was set aside because those who robbed their families were too large to fail. And that leads to number 2. Gen Z, they resent old power. Whether you like it or not, really for the past decade, we've seen as new generation come up, Gen Z, cry out for change. They're a generation that's been propagandized and used by aging politicians only to have their wishes, their demands, belittled and mischaracterized. It's a generation of ideological orphans left to their own device. And as much as older generations like to deride the youth and paint them and their demands as infantile, where were we? When academia preyed on them and politicians used them, what did we do? We laughed at compilations of their efforts online. We collectively deemed them to be unfavorable and unworthy. So how can we be surprised that they look up at the effigy of the past with anything other than resentment? Millennials and Gen X to a degree are, if anything, the failed parents of a bastard generation. And that generation is Gen Z. And that leads us to our last reason. They were robbed of their culture. It wasn't Gen Z who taught themselves to hate America and the West, that they have no right to have any pride in their roots or in their traditions. For more than a decade now, most of us sat back and watched as an entire generation was force-fed the most negative presentation of their history, teaching them that they were born from a uniquely evil nation and culture which holds no merit. We're a great nation. We're part of a more ancient and noble civilization. But in the collapse of family, we forgot that all of this, everything that's here around us right now, isn't meant for us. It's meant for those who come later. It's meant for those who come after us. We have given Gen Z no place in our story. So sadly, very sadly, they're gonna have to make their own. They have to make their own story. Because the story of America, the story of our people, is something that we hand down from generation to generation. But something happened over the past 20 or 30 years where our culture became nothing more than an expose on solipsism. Just a real practice of mental masturbation where we focus on me, we focus on the I, more than anything else. There's no idea of legacy anymore. We have failed to pass the torch of legacy, and we've left this entire generation in the dark. So what idea do they have of actually being Americans? So we can look at them and say, look how different they are from us. They don't work like us. And why would they work like us? They don't operate within society the way that we did, or the way that we expect them to, but we didn't teach them how to operate in our society. We didn't teach them what it is to be an American or to appreciate what it is to be from this country. Gen Z will inherit this nation, and they're going to make this nation into their own image. And it's not going to be the America that we think it's going to be. Really, at this point, you can say that we have no right to really complain in the direction that they go. We've abandoned them. They are an orphan generation. What responsibility do they have for us? If we've sat back for the past 20 years and just derided any of their actions, any of their wants and wishes we've belittled, as much as, yes, I can look at videos online and see selectively chosen clips of people who look very uneducated. But I don't think that that's anything that's particular to Gen Z. It was only 10 years ago that everyone's talking about how lazy, how stupid, how boring, how unoriginal millennials were. And then maybe this is something that just happens from generation to generation, but I can say that there is something very different about Gen Z. And that difference isn't a small one. And I think it's going to have a real ripple on the legacy of our nation, the identity of what it is to be from our country. And this is a very unique time to be in America. This is a very unique time in our history. And I know that every generation thinks that they're the last generation. Every generation of Christians always says that their age is the age of the second coming. There's something about humans that long to see themselves in the last days, I think. It's something that's very fascinating, in particular to mankind. But I don't think we give Gen Z the real credit that it deserves, and the kind of resiliency that it's lived, and the kind of resiliency that it's had to grow up in this time. There's been no stability. There's been no concrete basis in our culture. Everything's waxed and waned into a time right now where there's no faith in the system from any generation, really. There's been such a decline, and they've been there to witness it the whole time. They grew up in the decline. Unlike millennials, unlike Gen X, they weren't there for kind of the real peak of Americanism. They only got to see the war. They only got to see the collapse. They only got to see the global sicknesses. They only got to see the depraved nature of corporatism as it cannibalizes our government structures. They grew up to see the complete divestment of the American family by the US government. So what loyalty should they have to this system? Why shouldn't they want to change it irrevocably, so that it fits something that goes along the line of what they believe is true? Because that's what every generation does, really. The only real difference is that we didn't give them a foundation from them to build from. So they're going to have to build their own foundation. And the generation after them is going to have to go off that as well. And I think that this is really the last generation that remembers what America used to be. It's a transition to a new America. For better, for worse, that's just coming. That just is what it is. And you can say, oh, it's not going to be what it used to be. And I guarantee it won't. But it's going to be unique. It's going to be unique to this generation and the generation after that. And maybe that's a good thing. I think that the generations, Gen X, the millennials, Gen X, even generations before that, I think they've really rested on their laurels. When we look at the best architecture in America, we're not talking about things from the 80s, 90s, and after that. We're looking at things much older. It may sound strange now because it is a young generation and it's growing into themselves. But who's to say that Generation Z, as laughable as it may be to some of you, won't bring a new kind of renaissance? Because you can't tell. But if this is the conditions in which Gen Z was raised, their adolescence, then them coming into maturity, look at the world that they've inherited. Because that's what this is supposed to be. They're supposed to inherit this. They've matured into a world where they can't afford lives. They've entered maturity into one of the loneliest eras in world history, where no one has friends, no one has outside communications, no one has outside connections anymore. It's an era of social and physical seclusion. And going off that resentment, they look at the lives of their parents and their grandparents, and they now know that they'll never have that. They'll never have anything that comes close to that. Because for the vast majority, for 90% of that generation, they're going to be going through some of the toughest times, especially here in the future. They're going to be going through some of the toughest times that Americans have faced since the Great Depression. Because, that's what we're going to be going into. Everyone knows that something horrible is coming. There's a darkness on the horizon that we see, and it's coming. It just isn't here yet. And though many of us may not be here to meet it, Gen Z will. Beyond growing up in uncertainty, beyond the resentment of old power, beyond the absence of the culture in which they were meant to inherit, we look at the world that they're in now. We look at the world as it is now. How can we expect Gen Z to, wear the shoes of responsibility and really take the reins of the future? How can we expect that of it, really? But I think to look at them and to say that they're lazy, it's really misguided. It's almost like most people don't even know anyone who's in Gen Z. I know many people who are Gen Z, and they're very responsible people. Just like any generation, you have your go-getters and you have those who kind of fall to the wayside. But the only difference is now you have to be a hyper go-getter, and there's a lot of them that are out there, because there's a lot of them who have the willingness to do what it takes to actually pursue the life that their parents, their grandparents may have had, or to just try to get out of the position that they've been put into or that they were born into. That's still there. They're not lost, and they are the future. So we should really start acting like they are the future, like they are the ones who are going to be inheriting all this. If this means anything to us, if the legacy of America, of our culture, means anything to us, then it's incumbent on us to stand next to those who are younger than us and show them why it's important, why they should take the torch of that legacy. That's on us. It's on no one else. The generations of a country are nothing but a great family structure. The newest generation is the children, the one above that is the parents, and above that is grandparents, and so on and so on and so on. We as millennials, we as Gen Xers, we as baby boomers, we can't sit back and just laugh, and at the same time be angry because they're not being the Americans that we want them to be, that we never showed them that they could be. It's a real shame, and it's a real failure on us, and we have to do better, and that's really what it comes down to. That's why I don't think that I don't think that our culture is hopeless. I don't think that Gen Z is hopeless. Just like 10 years ago, everyone thought that millennials were hopeless, and I'm sure you go back and back and back. Every generation hated the generation before. Although this is a very different generation because of the technology, it makes it a very different generation. And maybe that's one of the reasons why so many of the older generations kind of sit back and look at them in awe and look at them in just a lack of understanding, because how can you understand growing up the way that they did? How can you understand? The truth is you can't. And because you lack communication with a lot of people who are in Gen Z, and because most of them, because they have to work so much and they're so overstimulated with everything that's going on in the world around them, they haven't even had time to really dive into their opinions and why they think the way that they think. And no one has time to break down their own belief structures anymore and know where they actually sit in that intellectual equation. No one does that anymore because time is an asset, and it's an asset that not many people have anymore. But that's all we have for today. If you agree, if you disagree, if you have any comments, if you just hate Gen Z, if you hate the boomers, if you hate Gen Xers, leave it in the comment sections. You guys can fight it out. It is fun to watch sometimes, but thanks for stopping by. This was a fun one. Had to jump around a little bit, but we got there in the end. So hope you guys have a good night.